Apparently, history isn't written by the winners. It's written by the loudest guy with a marker and zero fact-checking. Somehow, half our historical truths were born in basements, not textbooks. And trust me, the real absurdity hasn't even started yet. 1. Historians still defend the idea that medieval mapmakers drew sea monsters on coastlines because sailors truly believed giant squid held monthly HOA meetings near Iceland. But documentation exists of one cartographer openly admitting he added the creatures because the coastline looked boring and he needed to keep his patrons entertained. The funniest part is how this tiny act of artistic boredom eventually transformed into a full-blown scholarly truth, claiming that every ship captain genuinely thought the ocean was basically a reptile petting zoo. Generations of teachers repeated it with a straight face, as if hardened navigators ran screaming every time an oddly shaped wave touched the hull. The real conspiracy isn't that medieval people believed monsters existed, it's that modern people believed medieval people were that gullible, proving that academic confidence sometimes outruns common sense at Olympic speed. 2. A popular 20th century theory insisted that the pyramids were wired with supernatural energy fields that sharpened razor blades and preserved fruit, a claim made not by mystics in the desert, but by one guy in Prague who tested the idea using a cardboard model in his apartment, decided it definitely worked, and published it as scientific truth. What followed was a wave of people placing grapes under aluminum pyramids on their kitchen counters like they were charging them for remote psychic combat. A few magazines printed the theory without reading past the first paragraph, and decades later you still hear adults insisting ancient Egyptians mastered cosmic electricity as casually as modern people microwave leftovers. The conspiracy isn't the pyramids. It's that the entire world accepted a thesis that was basically geometry feels spooky, therefore science. 3. One conspiracy managed to turn a simple coincidence into a historical fact. The belief that Benjamin Franklin secretly founded a shadow government of owl-worshipping elites just because one eccentric collector found a decorative bird statue in his old house and decided it must be a cult artifact, not, household decoration. The rumor snowballed until people were lecturing at conferences about Franklin's alleged moonlit rituals involving candles, cloaks, and secret handshakes, while the actual documentation from the era shows him spending his nights arguing about taxes and trying not to die from 18th century medical practices. Yet somehow, the statue won, and the myth became so normalized that tour guides mention it casually like Franklin was juggling lightning rods in one hand and attending supernatural PTA meetings with the other. It's historical revisionism powered entirely by one guy's interior decorating paranoia. 4. A group of Victorian writers once decided that medieval peasants believed thunder was caused by giants bowling in the sky, even though no medieval record says anything remotely similar. The entire idea came from one children's book author who needed a cute metaphor and accidentally rewired cultural memory for the next century. Scholars repeated it, teachers repeated it, and eventually adults began insisting it must be true because people in the past didn't know science. Which is ironic considering the same peasants who supposedly thought clouds had a sports league also built cathedrals that modern engineers still call miracles of geometry. The real conspiracy wasn't the giants. It was the Victorian assumption that every earlier culture operated at the intellectual level of a lost toddler with a stick. 5. A bizarre rumor from the 1970s claimed that NASA discovered the moon was hollow after seismic equipment registered vibrations during landings, and instead of checking for, say, geological explanations, one enthusiastic writer declared it must be a giant alien gong, constructed by a forgotten species with impeccable carpentry skills. Magazines repeated it, TV hosts embraced it, and suddenly, people were treating the moon like a malfunctioning cosmic percussion instrument, placed there by extraterrestrials who apparently had access to space travel, but not enough imagination to design anything more interesting than a hollow rock. The actual scientists kept explaining that the moon vibrates because rocks do that. But at that point, the conspiracy had grown legs, wings, and an aggressive gym membership, becoming a historical fact quoted by anyone who failed geology but excelled in enthusiasm. 6. A Cold War theory insisted that medieval knights wore armor so heavy they needed cranes to mount their horses, a belief born from one badly interpreted museum exhibit where a display harness was mistaken for a hoisting device rather than a cleaning tool. The rumor allowed generations of people to imagine knights dangling helplessly from giant hooks like metallic piñatas before battle, and textbooks even echoed the idea as if Europe's entire military tradition hinged on knights being unable to stand up without industrial machinery. Real armor weighed less than a modern firefighter suit, but conspiracy logic doesn't bend for reality. It prefers the version where chivalric warriors swung swords while praying a gust of wind didn't knock them over like medieval Roombas. 7. A fringe theory gained traction claiming Shakespeare didn't write his plays because the handwriting in one surviving scrap didn't match his known signature. And instead of assuming the man simply had messy penmanship like every other writer in history, a group of amateur detectives constructed a full alternate timeline where a nobleman ghost wrote everything as a hobby between hunting trips and social scandals. The conspiracy snowballed into academic circles until people were confidently arguing that a guy who couldn't keep track of his estate finances somehow produced Hamlet in secret without leaving a single unmistakable trace. Ironically, the evidence for Shakespeare's authorship is far stronger than the evidence for anyone else. But the human brain loves stories where geniuses are replaced by aristocrats who had too much free time and too little creative output. 8. A rumor that the Great Wall of China is visible from space became so entrenched that astronauts had to continuously correct reporters. Yet the idea survives because one early journalist confidently declared it as fact after misinterpreting a blurry photograph taken from a low-orbit craft. The world embraced it instantly, not because it made sense, but because humanity loves the idea that a giant stone barrier is basically a cosmic neon sign flashing "Welcome to Earth" at passing aliens. The real conspiracy isn't that the wall can be seen. It's that people still argue about it as if all the astronauts are in on a cover-up to hide the fact that humanity doesn't have any giant space-friendly architecture except maybe that one Vegas hotel shaped like a pyramid. 9. An especially stubborn theory claims that medieval Europeans thought the Earth was flat, even though scholars of the time wrote entire treatises explaining its shape using shadows, measurements, and simple observation. The myth was invented centuries later by authors who needed to make historical figures look ignorant to create drama in their narratives. Ironically, the people who spread the myth were less interested in scientific accuracy than in making themselves appear intellectually superior, which explains why the story stuck. Nothing spreads faster than a conspiracy that lets modern readers feel smarter than everyone who lived before plumbing. The truth is that sailors, monks, merchants, and scholars all knew the Earth was round. But the myth persists because it's easier to mock imaginary idiots than admit history was full of competent adults. 10. One theory that somehow became historical canon insisted that Cleopatra died holding a tame pet cobra like a dramatic stage prop, even though the logistics of persuading a venomous snake to cooperate with theatrical suicide are slightly less realistic than training a tornado to perform synchronized swimming. Actual records suggest multiple more practical methods, but the snake story stuck because Victorian dramatists adored the visual and repeated it until audiences assumed Egyptians choreographed their own deaths like Broadway finales. The conspiracy isn't about the ASP, it's about how quickly a good aesthetic can defeat common sense, turning one queen's death into an ancient reptile-themed soap opera. 11. A persistent claim insists that medieval people believed tomatoes were poisonous because they resembled hearts, even though the real reason wealthy Europeans avoided them was because they ate tomatoes off pewter plates that leached lead into the juice, essentially turning every salad into a slow-acting science experiment. Instead of acknowledging their fancy tableware was poisoning them, they blamed the tomato. And later, historians decided the whole continent must have gone collectively insane at the sight of red produce. The conspiracy became such a normalized fact that people now imagine entire villages fainting at the sight of spaghetti sauce, forgetting the actual issue was a toxic dining tradition masquerading as elite taste. 12. An early 1900s rumor claimed the ancient Mayans predicted the exact date of the world's destruction, and instead of questioning why a civilization that excelled in astronomy would schedule the apocalypse like a dentist appointment, modern writers turned the whole idea into a best-selling prophecy. The theory spread so aggressively that some people prepared survival bunkers while others hosted countdown parties, all based on a misread calendar page that literally indicated a cycle ending, not cosmic demolition. The conspiracy became historical truth because it felt cinematic, and humanity has never met a dramatic misunderstanding it didn't immediately turn into a global panic with merchandise. 13. A strange belief developed claiming that Vikings used crystal sunstones to locate the sun during storms. And instead of acknowledging that the sagas describing them were metaphorical or poetic, conspiracy enthusiasts insisted Vikings carried magical GPS crystals that functioned better than most modern weather apps. The theory turned into a widely circulated historical fact, despite zero consistent archaeological evidence, because nothing sells better than the idea of enormous battle-hardened sailors navigating with enchanted mood rings. The real joke is that Vikings were excellent navigators due to knowledge, experience, and math. But apparently those explanations weren't magical enough. 14. A conspiracy theory once claimed that Leonardo da Vinci encoded predictions of modern technology inside his paintings, and entire documentaries confidently argued that he foresaw airplanes, smartphones, and possibly Wi-Fi, even though most of his sketches were just him fiddling with ideas the same way modern artists doodle robots when bored. Scholars kept explaining that Da Vinci was brilliant, but not clairvoyant. Yet the conspiracy flourished because people love imagining Renaissance painters whispering secret spoilers about the iPhone into their artwork. The idea became a historical fact repeated at museum tours, proving that the only thing humans love more than art is assigning it prophecies it never asked for. 15. One aggressively recycled myth claims that ancient Druids built Stonehenge as a power plant for storing mystical energy, an idea invented by a 19th-century writer who misunderstood archaeological drawings and decided the only reasonable explanation for large rocks was ancient renewable energy infrastructure. His imaginative leap soon turned into a widespread belief that prehistoric people were basically running a national grid powered by celestial moonbeams, and tour guides repeated the theory so often that it became hardened into pseudo-history. In reality, the builders of Stonehenge left no sign that they spent their evenings adjusting prehistoric voltage. But the conspiracy survives because humans prefer a version of the past where everyone was either technologically superior or spiritually electric. 16. Renaissance astrologers once convinced entire courts that comets were basically passive-aggressive Yelp reviews from the universe, and one group became so influential that a terrified king reportedly halted construction projects because he believed a comet disapproved of the scaffolding. The funniest part is how the astrologers framed every cosmic event as deeply personal, like the universe was a nosy neighbor with strong opinions about royal decision-making. And because their predictions occasionally aligned with random life events, people treated them as prophets instead of extremely committed guessers. Eventually, these poetic interpretations fossilized into historical facts, leaving modern students convinced that early scientists were spending their evenings decoding sky-based subtweets. The real conspiracy isn't that ancient astronomers misread the stars. It's that modern people confidently repeat these stories like rulers. Paused wars because a glowing rock in space decided to schedule a long-distance performance review. 17. Some Victorian-era thinkers genuinely believed that Egyptian pharaohs communicated with each other telepathically, not because of archaeological evidence, but because one eccentric scholar insisted the pyramids functioned as mental amplifiers, a phrase he never fully explained yet managed to publish in a journal anyway. The theory spread because people loved imagining ancient rulers sending brain-to-brain memos about taxes and coronations, as if Egypt were a giant psychic office building with excellent telecommunication service. Soon enough, museum plaques and textbooks echoed it with the confidence of someone who skipped the research portion of their research, turning telepathic pharaohs into a historical fact repeated at dinner parties by people who couldn't telepathically communicate with their own houseplants. The conspiracy wasn't the pyramids. It was how quickly a scholarly daydream became a global belief that ancient monarchs essentially invented Wi-Fi for thoughts. 18. One stubborn belief claims that medieval monks kept dragon's eggs locked in monastery vaults, a rumor born after one archaeologist misidentified a fossilized turtle shell and wrote an overly imaginative paper that spread faster than anyone could retract it. Suddenly, monks were depicted as reptile breeders running secret sanctuaries behind the choir stalls, and for decades illustrators portrayed medieval Europe like a fantasy wildlife reserve where dragons politely waited for prayer sessions to end before taking flight. Real monks left extensive records of grain harvests, weather patterns, and people failing to return borrowed tools, yet strangely none mentioned feeding their fire-breathing pets or handling hatchlings with oven mitts. But the absence of evidence didn't stop the rumor from graduating into a pseudo-fact. It lingers because people find it more thrilling to imagine Benedictine zookeepers than admit someone simply misread ancient laundry storage. 19. A fringe theory that gained absurd momentum insisted the ancient Greeks engineered soundproof amphitheaters using alien acoustics, not because aliens were involved, but because one early tourist declared the architecture too perfect for humans, as if millennia of mathematical talent couldn't possibly compete with extraterrestrial interns. The myth hardened into historical trivia, leaving generations convinced that aliens visited Earth exclusively to improve live theater conditions, apparently prioritizing stadium audio over, say, preventing wars or inventing antibiotics. Actual historians kept pointing out that the Greeks wrote extensively about geometry, resonance, and design, but conspiracy logic prefers a narrative where cosmic visitors fly across galaxies to fix someone's concert experience. The real conspiracy isn't alien architecture. It's the persistent belief that ancient people were incapable of solving problems unless supported by beings with superior Wi-Fi. 20. One particularly tenacious rumor insists that Marie Antoinette owned a secret book predicting every major European crisis, supposedly written by an oracle she kept in her personal chambers, a theory created by a novelist whose publisher demanded something spicier for marketing. The fake prophecy book eventually became accepted historical background, inspiring people to assume the Queen spent her days flipping pages like a bored time traveler checking tomorrow's weather. Meanwhile, the real records show she was drowning in political drama and bills, not interpreting cosmic forecasts with her morning pastries. Unfortunately, the allure of a royal fortune-telling manual proved irresistible, and soon lecturers repeated it with the confidence of someone revealing insider stock tips. The conspiracy lasted because nothing sells faster than the idea of a monarch who couldn't manage her finances, yet somehow mastered the future like a 1700s smartphone app. 21. A popular conspiracy that wormed its way into historical storytelling claimed that medieval blacksmiths infused swords with magical properties by humming power frequencies into the metal, an idea invented by a 19th-century romantic author who had apparently never spoken to a craftsman in his life. The rumor transformed ordinary workshops into mystical sound studios where burly men communed with steel as if forging hit singles. Museums later adopted the concept to spice up exhibits, failing to mention that real blacksmiths were just trying to avoid burns, fractures, and the constant threat of being stabbed by their own customers. The pseudo-fact survived because people prefer a version of history where weapons were basically enchanted Bluetooth devices rather than sharp hunks of metal hammered by exhausted humans who would have laughed at the suggestion they were producing magical audio engineering. 22. A misinterpreted medieval diagram led to the bizarre belief that ancient doctors prescribed singing to broken bones because someone mistook a doodle of a musician standing next to a patient for an official medical method. Suddenly, people imagined entire hospital wards echoing with desperate lute solos aimed at healing fractures, like a Renaissance karaoke bar with orthopedic benefits. The myth spread so thoroughly that even modern textbooks repeated it for a while, ignoring the glaring absence of any record suggesting doctors genuinely believed bone marrow responded to musical encouragement. The truth was far less dramatic. The doodle likely represented entertainment or ritual, not healthcare. But the narrative of melodic medicine proved too irresistible, giving future generations the impression that recovering from injuries once required both bed rest and a private concert, preferably with good acoustics and no refunds. 23. One conspiracy that somehow fossilized into an educational talking point claimed ancient Romans used crystals to store memories like primitive flash drives, a theory born from someone mislabeling a decorative glass bead as a data stone, a phrase that spread faster than actual archaeology. Soon documentaries were showing actors pretending to upload childhood recollections into shiny gemstones, while real scholars aged visibly in interviews trying to explain that Romans weren't encoding their thoughts into jewelry. The myth persisted because people wanted a prehistoric USB stick so badly they ignored the complete lack of evidence, embracing the idea like tech support for the dead. The conspiracy thrived by offering a past where emperors backed up their emotions next to their tax receipts, proving that nothing becomes a historical fact faster than a misunderstanding combined with excessive enthusiasm. 24. A surprisingly durable myth claimed the Aztecs constructed floating cities using levitation powered by volcanic magnetism, a phrase invented by a travel writer who misunderstood the concept of chinampas, simple floating gardens, and decided they must have been early anti-gravity prototypes. The idea grew into a full conspiracy ecosystem where people believed ancient engineers casually defied physics before breakfast. Real archaeological evidence shows intelligent, resource-efficient farming systems. But conspiracy logic prefers imagining a civilization running mystical hovercraft suburbs. The myth became historical truth in some circles because levitating architecture sounds more exciting than agricultural brilliance, even though it requires believing ancient farmers had mastered technology that would bankrupt modern engineers. 25. A strangely persistent rumor asserts that medieval executioners kept personal theme songs they played before work, all because someone found sheet music near a gallows site and jumped to conclusions rather than acknowledge musicians simply performed wherever crowds gathered. Over time, the rumor blossomed into a fact that executioners treated their jobs like professional wrestlers entering the ring, complete with dramatic pre-execution anthems. Teachers repeated it for decades with theatrical enthusiasm, leaving students convinced the Middle Ages resembled a grim talent show with mandatory musical numbers. Actual records show executioners were practical, discreet, and mostly trying to avoid being recognized at the market, not headlining concerts. But the conspiracy survived because people adore imagining history as a medieval Broadway production, where even public punishment required a soundtrack. 26. One conspiracy claims that ancient Chinese scholars built a secret underground network of libraries illuminated by perpetual flames that never extinguished. A belief born after one explorer saw a reflection in a damp cave and declared it eternal fire instead of, say, sunlight. Storytellers embraced the myth instantly, crafting tales of scholars roaming subterranean reading halls lit by magical torches powered by unknown chemistry. Eventually, some guidebooks mentioned it as though the entire empire operated on mystical cave lighting. The real explanation involved basic optical reflections, but fantasy always beats physics in a popularity contest. The conspiracy became a pseudo-fact because the idea of immortal flames supporting endless scholarship sounded like the sort of poetic nonsense people desperately want to be true. 27. A baffling but stubborn theory claimed that medieval cats were trained as postal workers after a historian misread a note about messenger cats, which actually referred to pest control animals kept near message archives. Conspiracy fans constructed elaborate systems explaining how cats supposedly navigated cities carrying letters, ignoring the reality that most cats can't decide whether they want to be inside or outside for longer than 3 seconds. The myth gained traction because humans love imagining historical logistics powered by tiny, disgruntled mammals. Eventually, the theory masqueraded as factual trivia, even though no records show cats participating in organized mail delivery unless the mail consisted of dead mice. The conspiracy lasted because people delighted in picturing ancient cities running on per-based communication networks. 28. A long-standing pseudo-fact insists that Norse explorers carried enchanted runestones that glowed in the presence of danger, a belief jump-started by a single archaeologist who misinterpreted mineral fluorescence and accidentally described it as supernatural alertness. Storytellers ran with the idea, transforming practical navigation tools into early warning systems that supposedly detected enemies, storms, and awkward social situations. No actual sagas mention glowing rocks delivering tactical advice, but that didn't stop the rumor from entering popular history books like an uninvited guest at a Viking feast. The conspiracy persists because glowing objects feel inherently magical, and people prefer believing ancient warriors carried portable mood lights instead of ordinary stones reacting to ultraviolet exposure. 29. Perhaps the most ambitious theory transformed ancient Mesopotamian astronomers into time-traveling mathematicians who allegedly predicted modern stock markets, an idea birthed from one scholar's poetic metaphor that was later interpreted with dead seriousness. Soon, documentaries portrayed scribes carving future economic downturns into clay tablets like they were running Wall Street from 3000 BCE. The myth became so inflated that some enthusiasts argued ancient priests understood global finance better than modern economists, which, frankly, might be the most believable part of the entire narrative. Real tablets contain star charts, crop records, and complaints about taxes, not NASDAQ forecasts. But the conspiracy became a historical fact among people who desperately wanted the past to be both mystical and financially literate. The The truth is simpler. Someone misunderstood a metaphor, and humanity eagerly built a time-traveling banking legend out of it. And that's our grand tour of humanity, proudly misunderstanding everything. Drop your vote for the dumbest one below, or add an even worse example if you dare. Go on, feed the chaos.